Giordano Bruno, who wrote one of the most important books on memory techniques, was burned at the stake in the year 1600, and he now comes into orbit with another giant of education who once had the guts to defend human imagination in front of the Senate Subcommittee on Communications chaired by John Pastore on May 1st, 1969, with this important message.
And I feel that if we in public television can only make it clear that feelings are mentionable and manageable, we will have done a great service for mental health. I'm constantly concerned about what our children are seeing. And for 15 years I have tried in this country and Canada to present what I feel is a meaningful expression of care.
Do you narrate it?
I'm the host, yes. And I do all the puppets, and I write all the music, and I write all the scripts.
Well, I'm supposed to be a pretty tough guy, and this is the first time I've had goosebumps for the last 2 days.
Well, I'm grateful not only for your goosebumps, but for your interest in our kind of communication.
Why did I just show you that clip? Well, our kind of communication as fans of memory techniques and practitioners of the memory arts is currently in danger. And in this video, I'm going to explain why Fred Rogers has been as important to the development of memory techniques in our era as Giordano Bruno was in his. And who knows what beautiful books about memory Bruno would have written if speaking his mind about truths we now hold as common sense and obvious hadn't ended his life. Thank goodness Rogers lived in more civil times. Who knows how many wonderful episodes of Fred Rogers' show would never have aired if he hadn't had the courage to sing a song as relevant to adults now as it was to audiences of all ages back in 1969. His teaching also contained some direct words, ideas and images that now seem in danger in the same way Bruno's once were. Although Giordano Bruno's memory techniques were not the reason they executed him, he was so cautious about being misunderstood that he taught them in intentionally elaborate and cryptic ways. We already have to be too cautious as educators who need to use examples in order to teach, as I've seen on this channel and my film studies channel, around copyright issues clashing with fair use scholarship principles. And now, changes to the law, YouTube, and gradual shifts to the internet as such are suggesting we who benefit from an ongoing discussion about memory techniques will be forced to teach even more cryptically than Bruno in our free memory teaching, thanks to a variety of issues that have culminated in COPPA. In this video, I'll share why I think COPPA and similar initiatives that threaten the teaching of memory techniques are good initiatives, but as currently written, are perhaps too overreaching and endanger the nature of human memory, creativity, and the expression of universal archetypes that are useful in the minds of all people, from those currently in school to those at the helm of Disney. COPPA, or the Children's Online Privacy Protection Rule, is something I encourage you to learn more about using the links in the description below. In brief, it brings in new legislation that prevents adult content creators from making references to or using elements of pop culture that also interest younger audiences. Of the several factors that impact those of us who create or consume memory training content for adults, these are the main points that are problematic and you need to consider if you care about the memory tradition. Whether the video includes characters, celebrities, or toys that appeal to children, including animated characters or cartoon figures, whether the language of the video is intended for children to understand, whether the video includes activities that appeal to children, such as play acting, simple songs or games, or early education, whether the video includes songs, stories, or poems for children. These conditions are problematic because teachers of memory techniques refer to all of these categories in their teaching, and many adults come to me wishing they could remember the simplest of songs to sing with their family members. Plus, most good writers know that the quality of education has plummeted so low in the last decades, we're forced to write at a grade 5 level if we want to be understood by the average adult. Nonetheless, I still use big words from time to time, but also do what I can to simplify the language I use out of a love of language and these techniques, which require us to excavate material from deep in our memory in order to experience lasting success. Unlike Bruno, I want everyone to understand memory techniques, and I like all kinds of writing, both challenging and simple. It's in our nature to seek and benefit from variety, and everyone from Roald Dahl to Stephen King have shown their abilities with both elaborate diction and overtly simplistic prose depending on their audience, which all the intention in the world will never ensure. I read Dahl's dirtiest books when I was in elementary school. Now I find them too simplistic, whereas in my 40s, the multi-layered nuances of Charlie and the Chocolate Factory make it hard to believe I ever understood it as a kid. Many things, from the Muppets to Max Maven, have appeal to multiple age groups at the same time. As someone with a film studies background, COPPA also immediately reminded me of the Hays Code. This was the informal name for the Motion Picture Production Code. It was introduced in 1930 and was seriously enforced starting in 1934. The code was a set of rules that controlled how American filmmakers expressed themselves for over 3 decades. During that time, film could only depict what were considered the correct standards of life, unless the plot called for something else. One weird side effect of the Hays Code was that it left us thinking that those times in history were more peaceful and people were better off than they actually were. Indeed, some directors avoided taking on films that centered on topics like poverty, as such stories and images would have conflicted with the code. Soon, however, filmmaking was back to pre-code standards and we got the kind of excesses of violence and problematic content that so concerned Mr. Rogers. As you'll soon discover, he gave all of us many tools for coping with the world as it is, not coping with it by censoring our artistic representations of it. As we saw in our Mandela Effect video and its discussion area, the consequences to our collective memory and critical thinking skills are extreme and create costs too hard for many to bear, harder than just learning to deal with the world as it is. Now, before he was executed, Bruno referred to the solar system and constellations and taught how to use them as sophisticated memory devices. He used heavenly bodies that appeal equally to people of every age and origin, as they should. They inhabit the very same sky that circles us all, just as Fred Rogers was the burning sun of my childhood and someone who I'm now being discouraged from even referring to in a dual reality where both young and old people might be interested in the teachings of the most important individual television of a certain era had ever seen. So much so that even Tom Hanks, one of the most highly regarded actors of our times, was hired to portray him in a movie that appeals to all age groups. As it should, given the importance of Fred Rogers for learning to be a mature adult in a complicated world that requires childlike imagination to truly thrive in. I'm a direct descendant of Fred Rogers in spirit and tone, not only because I've carefully studied his career and applied what I've learned from it in the forms of, for example, my characters Edgar and the evil Dr. Forget, creations for adults that one would only mistake as being directed at anyone but adults in the same way you'd have to work very hard to misinterpret South Park's target audience. And I also hold an MA in Media and Communications and did a lot of study of film and TV history for my PhD. This background directly influences how I teach memory techniques, but also how I use Fred Rogers in the techniques themselves, including many references to the imagination of Fred Rogers, productions that the Senate ultimately decided to protect. And thank goodness for that. My childhood would have been even more miserable than it already was without him. But it's not just Fred Rogers and all the characters in his neighborhood. In the Magnetic Memory Method teaching, we refer to the constellations of toys adults remember from their use to the fictional characters we remember from cherished stories we will always hold dear, even during the grips of a senile dementia we might have avoided by using our minds the way people like Fred Rogers asked our younger selves to do. Now, by the way, if you're new here and you want to know how memory techniques can help you learn and remember more fast, get subscribed. I'm Anthony Metivier from MagneticMemoryMethod.com, which is devoted to helping all people discover their vast potential and accomplish their goals by enhancing memory in ways that are easy, effective, elegant, and fun. Now, I will say that I'm generally in favor of COPPA's initiative to stop the data tracking of minors and all the misconduct around advertising analytics out there. Data-driven advertising is currently endangering the abundance of things that were great about the internet, particularly for education-driven initiatives like the Magnetic Memory Method, which only ever advertises itself through ample doses of free teaching, and always free teaching first through this YouTube channel, my podcast, and the Magnetic Memory Method blog. Yes, there are bad actors on the internet, and many of the initiatives to stop questionable online data gathering, analysis, and campaign creation are true and proper in spirit. Indeed, anyone who has studied the history of media and advertising knows that great campaigns have been crafted without all of the data analysis the internet has enabled. But some of the laws and actions taken to fight inappropriate uses of our data are not only impossible to execute, but quite potentially overreaching from the start. The risks are obvious to memory in many ways, and the threat goes much deeper than memory training. Let's make an analogy. In George Orwell's 1984, Winston Smith is made to agree that 2 and 2 make 5, even though it is painfully obvious to any coherent brain that the sum of this equation is 4. Big Brother, a villainous force of sovereignty personified by the thought police agent O'Brien, is successful in bringing Winston Smith to this horrible conclusion through physical and psychological torture that distorts the very nature of his mind and memory. Perceivers of the truth, and those willing to speak it, even if only in private journals and hushed whispers, are ferreted out with the help of Big Brother's surveillance technologies. Well, in 1984, Big Brother and O'Brien had nothing like what we have now with online dynamic behavioral data analytics. And unfortunately, the tools that could be employed in the service of exposing the Big Brothers we face in the 21st century are being used to create what Jonathan Haidt and others have identified as safe spaces. Now, I personally do not object to YouTube or anyone else creating filters that ensure only adults and mature individuals can access any content online. But when it comes to matters of the imagination and constellations in the sky, or our memories of books we've read or movies we've seen, it is in human nature to share and connect and teach on the basis of cultural references, regardless of age. Instead of developing software algorithms that punish or delete people for referring to pop culture references, couldn't we use these tools to help adults take responsibility for their families? Aren't references to matters of pop culture interest the last place we should censor or erect difficulties of expression around when, as Mr. Rogers said, our role should be to make it clear that our role as creators is to make whatever we're feeling mentionable and manageable? For example, how can I know if a certain talking cat, be it Garfield or a Cheshire Cat, is appealing to any particular demographic when both are writ as large as Orion or the Big Dipper on the pop culture sky? How can I anticipate how a robot is going to interpret such references, or in the case of trying to avoid offending someone, how any person might react to a talking cat most of us find just as funny in adulthood as we did in our youth, if not more so? How is it even possible to take on such self-editorial burdens that are in effect impossible for any educator who must refer to examples in order to be sensible to students who learn through association made by reference? Such a burden is not yet as extreme as bending oneself to say that 2 + 2 = 5, but it is a slippery slope in that direction. If we banish or make punishable references to pop culture that appeals to all ages, how long before we ban words and ideas that appeal to all generations? Freedom, for example, creativity, the very acts of independent critical thinking that lead to innovation for which schools are said to exist. In one of the most important moments of standing up for what is right and true in the previous century, and as you now know, one of my favorite childhood and adult mentors, Fred Rogers, went before Senate. He was successful in getting his program appropriately funded, and I have had his influence as an educator in my heart and mind for many years. Does it stand to reason that he too can no longer be referenced because he is better known to a certain demographic, especially one whose goal was to create better adults by giving them good and true things to remember? And now it's risky to quote him, quoting his own song for children, to illustrate a point before the adults that formed Senate as he explains the ways he helped and wanted to continue helping people live in psychologically healthy ways in a world dominated by advertising, egregious violence, and more? But no other quote quite suffices, and using it from Fred Rogers himself, as he quotes himself before Senate, best illustrates the vertiginous nature of this problem of censoring our collective memory. These are lyrics to a song that all people around the world would do well to remember, as Mr. Rogers advises.
What do you do with the mad that you feel when you feel so mad you could bite? When the whole wide world seems oh so wrong, and nothing you do seems very right. What do you do? Do you punch a bag? Do you pound some clay or some dough? Do you round up friends for a game of tag or see how fast you go? It's great to be able to stop when you've planned a thing that's wrong and be able to do something else instead and think this song. I can stop when I want to, can stop when I wish, can stop, stop, stop anytime. And what a good feeling to feel like this and know that the feeling is really mine.
I don't know if we can stop bad actors on the internet, but here are a few things I suggest. I know people are busy and that life is complicated, but get involved in the lives of your family members and remember Mr. Rogers' song. Explain the importance of memory and practice the memory palace together. Memorize good things so there might be fewer bad actors out there in the future. Then write a letter to Senate and explain the dual reality in which it applies to people of all ages. And explain that not everything in the world is as cheery as we might like, and that not even Mr. Rogers himself tried to hide that fact. Quite the opposite. Mr. Rogers helped us unearth the bad aspects of life, face it, and deal with our troubles in better ways. And old Bruno, he tried that too in his works. They burned him at the stake for standing up to the Senate of his time. You know, they say that people who don't know their history are doomed to repeat it. Frankly, it seems that even people well-versed in history are also doomed to repeat it. Memory is likely the explanation due to factors like the procedural memory that holds us fast in bad habits and the primacy effect that forces us to pay more attention to our preferences than the facts and rules that govern reality. And what you do with your memory and that freedom to imagine what you need to imagine to learn and remember faster is enabled by association to memory itself. This is called mnestic memory, the memory of what your memory truly is. And when you use memory techniques to be able to do something instead and think this song, and you can stop when you want to, you can stop when you wish, you could stop anytime. And what a good feeling to feel true power and know that the internet is really ours. At the risk of yet another quote that appeals to all ages and is a powerful tool of memory you'll definitely want to tap into if you aren't already. Write the Senate and Congress, make it so, dear memorizers. And until we have a chance to speak again, keep yourself magnetic.
I think it's wonderful. Looks like you just earned the $20 million.